Welcome to the Tough Decisions Network. This is our special Sunday edition called Survive and Thrive with Dennae. Your host, Dennae Hanford, will dive deep into chapter-by-chapter discussions on specifically selected books to help you make better decisions as an entrepreneur. Visit toughdecisions.net to sign up for our free weekly entrepreneur email. Before we get started, let's hear from one of our sponsors. Have you ever thought about investing in real estate, but find yourself so busy that you don't have time for it? Do you have FOMO, which is the fear of missing out? At HanfordCapital.com, we help investors with passive real estate investments that project better returns than traditional investment vehicles such as the stock market. If you'd like to find out more about our passive real estate investments, visit HanfordCapital.com. That's HANDFORD capital.com. We will jump on a call with you to discuss your investment goals and to see if our investments are a good fit for you. This advertisement is not to be construed as an offer or recommendation to buy or sell a security. Visit HanfordCapital.com.
On the Tough Decisions podcast today, we are talking with Brian Davidson. He is the founder of the Intrinsic Institute. Brian, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me on, Dennae.
Let our audience know a little bit about who you are and what you've been working on. Then we'll get into talking about your Intrinsic Institute and the profile that you've developed.
As far as my background goes, I started off my career as a teacher. I was a teacher up in the Twin Cities, and I was super fascinated in what made my kids successful. And at that point in time, I thought it came down to intrinsic motivation and self-discipline. And so I wanted to figure out how those qualities develop in people. And so I came down to the University of Kansas and started a PhD in counseling psychology. And so I started to learn about all these various constructs like grit and resilience and hope and self-efficacy. And with my background in education, I started to wonder if it's possible to cultivate these skills. So here I was doing rotations as a university counseling psychologist in training, working to provide therapy for students with anxiety and depression. And I started to think, we've got this all backwards. Why do we wait until students are struggling so much before we start to equip them with these skills? And so can we try to teach and cultivate factors like resilience and grit and growth mindset to help individuals succeed and do well? And so I then had the light bulb go on and said, this is what I want to do with my career, is develop some sort of organization that would do this. And started to test out a comprehensive model of these factors with students. And then after year, I continued to refine this model, and we found it was predicting academic performance incredibly well with students. And then for my dissertation, we looked at the relationship of these noncognitive skills to leadership success. And we found that these factors were the best predictors of who was going to be a strong leader within an organization. When I was defending my dissertation, I told my committee, I said, what got me into this score, my grades and my GRE scores. I said, but that's not what got this dissertation done. What got this dissertation done are things like my motivation, my grit, my resilience, self-control, and these other non-cognitive factors. So I said, why are we not doing a better job trying to identify these factors in people coming into the university, let alone trying to build these qualities to help students succeed? And so to make a long story short, then we took the leap of faith to launch the Intrinsic Institute. And for the past several years, we've been working very hard to validate our psychological assessment and have tested this out in many different areas, from anywhere from using it with students in higher education settings to measuring student athletes in college programs to organizations across the world. So it's been a fun process. And of course, we're learning a lot.
So over the last couple of weeks on my Sunday podcast, we've been talking about some of these non-cognitive skills that are really valuable. And so I was wondering if you can just discuss how you came up with your list, because, we've talked about as many as 25 or 30 qualities, and I'm sure there are lists that are even bigger than that. But how did you come up with your list? And if you will talk, I know I saw, you have 3 key strands of human excellence. That's how you have them divided up. And then there's 3 more qualities that are kind of the ones that bind everything together. So how did you come up with your list and come up with that construct?
That's a good question. So it's based off of a tremendous amount of research. So if I go all the way back to my days in my counseling psychology program, learning about all these constructs, I started to realize that, they're all so closely related to one another, that there's some interdependence between many of these factors. And so I started to think it's a lot like strands of a rope, and that theoretically, we believe that there's this synergistic effect that happens with these skills. So as you improve growth mindset, for instance, that's going to help foster grit. As you improve grit, that's going to help foster resilience. And so we use this 3-stranded rope as our model. The first strand of the rope is largely trying to pick up on who's going to be highly self-motivated. So who's got that internal drive, that internal fire that burns within inside them. And so we're measuring a factor like self-awareness, whether or not the person knows and utilizes their strengths on a regular basis, as well as whether or not they've got a clear understanding of who they are as an individual, something called self-concept clarity that we find in the psychological literature. Also looking at growth mindset, the belief that your talent and potential can be cultivated through effort, as well as self-determination, whether somebody's pursuing a goal that's really meaningful to them, as well as whether or not they're pursuing something that gives them a great sense of purpose in what they're doing, where they feel like they're part of something that's bigger than themselves. And then finally, we're looking at self-efficacy, this confidence that you can accomplish your goals. And so those four factors come together to create somebody that's going to be quite highly motivated. The second strand of our rope's looking at whether the person's going to be very disciplined and perseverant. And so we're looking at the person's grit, which is this passion and perseverance for long-term goals. Conscientiousness is this attention to detail, being very reliable, dependable. Self-discipline is about getting yourself to do work when it's not all that fun and enjoyable. And self-control is largely about resisting temptations and delaying gratification. So I first developed those first two parts of the model. And then really it was life experience told me that, boy, you also have to be able to adapt to change and deal with adversity when it pops up. And so that was the latter portion that developed. And so when we're looking at what leads somebody to be able to do that, we're measuring a person's adaptability, their internal locus of control, which is looking at more about when circumstances happen, does the person just put up their hands and say, there's nothing I can do about this? Or do they say, yes, I can't always control the circumstances around me, but I can control how I respond to those circumstances. And that's going to be somebody that's high in internal locus of control. Third, we're looking at an aspect called hope. Hope in psychology is not about wishful thinking, but much more about when you come to roadblocks in your life, can you generate pathways around those roadblocks? And then finally, we're looking at resilience. So when life knocks us down or throws us that big major curveball in life, how can we respond? Can we deal with that adversity and ultimately emerge from that adversity, hopefully stronger than before? So the theory is, if you want to find a high-performing individual, whether or not we're talking about students in schools, leaders of organizations, or entrepreneurs, we want to find individuals that are highly self-motivated, that first strand. That's very disciplined and perseverant, that second strand. The third strand, which is looking at the ability to adjust well to change and bounce back from adversity. And then finally, Dennae, if you think about rope, it's typically held together on the ends by something. A lot of times that's wax or tape. And if you don't have that wax or tape there with rope, what happens to the rope?
It's going to fall apart.
It unravels, right? And so not only do you want all those factors, but we believe it's also very important for a person to have high levels of integrity. And so when we did our statistical analysis of this, we found integrity broke down into whether or not a person has a strong moral compass. Are they willing to cheat and steal in order to get a competitive edge? Do they have a sense of honesty, where they're truthful and honest in their work, as well as a sense of ethics, where they're trying to do good in people's lives and avoiding doing any harm? So that's largely how we came about developing all of this. And of course, now we've done all the statistical analyses and factor analysis and other tests to figure out how these constructs come together.
Recently, we've also talked a little bit about motivation and volition and the difference between those two. And if we're talking about these qualities and trying to teach them to whether it's students or employees or future leaders, do you have any observations about what it takes to get that person to the point where they are internally motivated? And I know that's not 100% the right way to say it, but they get to that place where they have the volition to start working on these qualities themselves.
Yeah, it's a great question and really a deep question. When it comes to motivation, a key factor of this is the person's, self-awareness. So whether or not they have a clear sense of who they are and ultimately where they're going. Self-determination is also going to play a big role in this. What we know from self-determination theory is that people are going to be highly motivated when they have a strong sense of autonomy. So does the person feel like they have choice in the matter of what they're doing? If you don't feel like you have choice in the matter, it's hard to be highly motivated as an individual. But if you do have choice, that definitely helps. And then finally, think about, is what you're doing, is it something that's bigger than yourself? Is what you're doing serving something that's greater than just any single individual? And we find those individuals that have a greater sense of purpose and that they're serving something bigger than who they are as an individual person, they tend to be a lot more self-motivated or intrinsically motivated than other individuals.
Now, I know from our conversation before we started this recording that you have developed some curriculum to teach some of these strategies. And, we talked that really the earlier you can start with individuals, the better. That being said, what have you found to be some of the most successful strategies for teaching these non-cognitive skills?
Well, I think the first thing to realize is that we can cultivate these skills. That's probably the most important as well as exciting factor, that these are not set in stone, that we can cultivate these skills really at any age. Now, the earlier that we can start, the better. And how we do this? Well, we start having conversations about this, okay? From a very early age, talk with your kids about the importance of persevering. And then I'd say most importantly, model these skills. Okay, the more that we can model these skills ourselves and have students in schools see every single educator that's walking through the halls and in their classrooms that exhibit these skills, well, that becomes the norm. Okay, as a head coach of a football program, if you model these skills yourself, then your players see this. Okay, as a leader of an organization, if you model these skills, if you exhibit these skills, that becomes the norm. That becomes the culture. And so modeling is probably the most important thing when it comes to developing these skills.
Could you share maybe with our audience one or two of the most interesting either case studies or groups of people that you've been able to work with and research, or maybe some of the more interesting outcomes that you have seen in your research?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of studies, anything from students' academic performance to student athletes. Probably the study that we did with this program up in Missouri was really fascinating. So we studied this program called Northwest Missouri State Bearcats, their football program. Now, they're a Division II football program, and they are a dominant powerhouse program. And so we wanted to figure out what makes them tick. And we first had their coaching staff complete the intrinsic profile. And we found that their coaches scored incredibly high on many of these non-cognitive factors. In fact, still to this date, we've not seen a collective group of individuals that have had quite their levels of non-cognitive skills. That's what we saw on that coaching staff. And then we had the players take the assessment. And then after that, we had the coaches evaluate the players on their intangibles. We wanted to ask them about, the players' motivation, their drive, determination, their leadership skills, their mental toughness, their attitude, all these factors outside of athletic ability that the coaches deemed were important. And we wanted to see whether or not these non-cognitive skills could shed light on those intangible qualities as rated and evaluated by those coaches. And we found that they did. And the three best predictors we found were the player's self-efficacy, so the confidence that they can accomplish their goals, as well as their self-control, the ability to resist temptations and delay gratification. But the best predictor, Dennae, was the player's integrity levels, which was very surprising. I thought in the rough and tough world of football, right, that factors like grit and resilience, some of these tougher terms, would be the best predictors. But integrity went on to be the best predictor. And so that was a surprising finding. And when I was sharing these results with the coaching staff, they looked at me like, well, why is that so surprising? That makes complete sense to us. And one of the coaches said, geez, if we can't trust our players, we can't do anything. So it starts with trust. It starts with integrity. And so it's just a real fun study that we did, looking at a real impressive program that's doing a lot of great work to cultivate some strong student leaders.
Integrity is a little bit of a surprising thing as far as being the most reliable predictor of their ratings from the coaches. I know you and I talked about the fact that that may not necessarily be true in other contexts or other environments, but especially, at least for this one, it was. And it would be interesting to do further, I think, research along those lines to see if that did hold true in other areas.
Well, and that's the great thing with our software platform now, is we can help out organizations figure out which factors truly are the best predictors of their performance outcomes. And so we can identify that and help to isolate those particular constructs that are the most important.
And so our audience is largely entrepreneurs, small business owners looking to hire perhaps, leaders, managers. What can you, as far as your intrinsic profile, offer them as a way of maybe improving their organization or improving their people and finding the right people to lead?
Yeah, so our main goal right now is to use this tool as a developmental tool primarily. So that way you can take your existing individuals that you've hired and learn what's going on between the ears of these individuals, and then have a set of recommendations that are personalized for that individual on how they can work with that person to help cultivate these skills. So for instance, we'll have a score for every single individual on how they scored on growth mindset, on grit, on resilience. And then we have a set of solutions and insights that help that organizational leader learn what they can do and the conversations that they can have to help cultivate those particular non-cognitive factors within each employee. So the goal is really try to cultivate these skills. And then, if we determine that there are certain skills that are showing to predict performance quite well, then potentially we could look at using it as an HR selection tool. But primarily right now, we try to focus much more on the developmental side. Say, let's try to build these skills in these individuals that you've already hired.
Very good. Now, before we go, I want you to give our audience a way for them to find you, whether it's on social media or on the internet. What's the best place for them to look if they're interested in your intrinsic profile or any of the curriculum or other things that you have to offer? Where can they find you?
Yep. So we've got intrinsicinstitute.com is our website. We've also got some social media on Twitter, intrinsic_INST as the Twitter feed. Of course, you can hit me up on LinkedIn, Brian Davidson. Find me there, and I always love to connect with like-minded individuals who are passionate about measuring performance outcomes and ultimately developing individuals' potential. So feel free to reach out.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I know you're a busy entrepreneur, and we appreciate you coming on and just sharing some of your expertise and experience with us today.
Thanks so much for your time, Dennae. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Tough Decisions Network. Be sure to visit toughdecisions.net to gain access to show notes for this episode and to join our free weekly entrepreneur email where we will send you news about the latest technology for your business, inspiring quotes, and the latest books for entrepreneurs. That's toughdecisions.net.